What's up, class? Professor Calderon here. We are in. This is a video for week 8, and yeah, we are talking about the genre still, and I'm in the book directly. Uh-oh, on page 322, engaging with reality, the documentary. So for those who don't know, I'm sure you all know. I'm just going to say this just in case. The documentary film is different than the fiction film, in that the documentary film is dealing in strict reality. It's sort of documenting history and then putting a perspective within that narrative. And I say narrative, it's not the same as in fiction. I say narrative in that they're finding the story within the structure of the documentary film itself. Okay? So, engaging with reality, documentary. In the US, the Depression and the arrival of synchronized sound had a profound impact on documentary film practices. The modernist aesthetic that had characterized the important documentary work of the 1920s gave way to a new emphasis on social, economic, and political concerns. While documentaries of the 1930s often challenged the policies and politics of established government, many filmmakers in the West and in Japan developed new ties with governments during the decades, often to make films advocating progressive goals. These ties were further developed during the Second World War, as documentary played a crucial propaganda role on both sides of the conflict. So as the war broke out, both sides were making films, and they took on this propaganda role. By the 1930s and 1940s, documentary increasingly became a form that reached and influenced mass audiences for purposes beyond entertainment. So now you have the purpose of the film has changed. Before it used to be to entertain. Now with the advent of war, but they're looking to sway public opinion, so to speak. The explorer, adventure, travel guide genre remained highly popular throughout the 1930s. A theme running through many of these was the challenging but triumphant deployment of Western technologies in underdeveloped or inaccessible areas. So that was one of the themes, the colonialist adventurer that had emerged in the documentary. They were documenting these adventurers going into uncharted territory, so to speak. Moving on, other documentarians of the time expressed an ethnographic impulse by moving away from the illustrated lecture and looking towards the synced sound fiction film as a model. So before they would play a film, a documentary, and they would have someone lecture on what they were seeing. So now with synced sound, they're moving away from that, and they're having the sound within the movie narrate the movie itself. During the 1930s, Anglo-American documentaries increasingly turned to social issues, concerns with problems facing industrial nations racked by depression and political upheaval. The foremost practitioner of the social issue documentary, one who profoundly shaped nonfiction filmmaking in Great Britain and eventually throughout much of the world, was John Grierson. Grierson had worked briefly as a film critic in the United States, where he condemned most Hollywood product in vehement terms. Moving on, more than anything else, the British documentaries of the 1930s showed that nonfiction films could be artistically innovative. Sponsored by the Ceylon Tea Board through the EMB, it looked at British colonies and how a new elliptical style that had perfectly matched its evocation of an exotic, distant land. So now there's this new style, this new aesthetic that's kind of, or a different aesthetic that's emerging in documentary films. I'm on page 325 now, middle of the page. Dozens of other short films were made by British documentary film movement in the 1930s. The film Spare Time of 1939, Humphrey Jennings' first important film, stands out for its sympathetic yet unheroic depiction of working class leisure activities, and its style, the juxtaposition of only loosely related sounds and images, looks toward his later work. Grierson had a counterpart in the United States, Pere Lawrence, whose involvement in film also began when he was a receiver for the New York-based newspaper and periodicals. Lawrence called cinema the stillborn art and railed against censorship and sought alternatives to mainstream Hollywood filmmaking. So these are different two names that have emerged during the time, and how they're embraced by the powers that be. In the late 1938, after the success of The River, which is a film, Roosevelt established the U.S. Film Service, headed by Lawrence, which was designed to make films for the various departments of the U.S. government. Lawrence started on films never Lawrence started on the films Never Finish, Eco Herms about unemployment. Then he switched his energies to The Fight for Life in 1940, a film about childbirth, infant mortality, and maternity risk associated with unsanitary conditions in poor urban neighborhoods. So they're seeing this documentary now as this medium for change, social change, and social issues. And the president at the time in 1938, Roosevelt, establishes this organization, this commission, to start making these films that talk about the living conditions in the U.S. Moving forward. Within Great Britain and the United States, there was a substantial amount of documentary production that addressed economic and social issues from a left-wing standpoint. The Workers' Film and Photo League was active in both countries. In the United States, this group was able to make inexpensive silent newsreels, such as Unemployment Special in 1931 and the National Hunger March in 1931, as well as political documentaries such as On the Waterfront. The organization provided a training ground for American filmmakers in a similar way to the Empire Marketing Board and the GPO unit in Britain. Its members left in the 1930s to form independent organizations. Yeah, the U.S. and Great Britain took up the call. They started these organizations that became like the training ground for their filmmakers, their national filmmakers for documentaries. Propaganda in the shadow of the World War. Although German filmmakers produced hundreds of documentaries which avoided overt Nazi propaganda during the 1930s, Hitler's assumption of power in February of 1933 made left-wing filmmaking impossible. The foremost German filmmaker of the period was Leni Riefenstahl, an actress and fiction film director who turned to documentary production after Hitler asked her to film the 1933 Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg. So around the world, the different countries were sort of responding to this propaganda power that film had in different ways in the shadow of war. You had Hitler, who appointed sorry, I get her name wrong. You had Hitler, who appointed Riefenstahl to record or to film important events in Germany, and they were, of course, going to use them for propaganda. In France, the political documentary in France followed a very different pattern. After a slow start, the breakthrough came with La Vie est à la nous, which translates into Life is Ours, and it was an electoral campaign film produced for the French Communist Party in early 1936. When civil war erupted in Spain, okay, the country's filmmakers turned to nonfiction filmmaking in large numbers. Many films were made on the Republic side, with Louis Brunel and Pierre Unic producing España in 1936. Okay. In Japan, the invasion of Manchuria also attracted the attention of filmmakers from many countries. China Strikes Back, Frontier Films in 1937. They showed Mao Zedong in Yang'an After the Long March, and John Furno and Joris Ivens' 400 Million, 1939, presented gruesome footage of the Japanese offensive. After the Second World War had as you can imagine, had a profound effect on different markets. And I'm on the bottom of 327. With the World War, documentary assumed a critical propagandistic role to instill domestic audiences with the will to persevere and win, and to shape perceptions at home as well as in allied and neutral countries. Most wartime documentaries were made under the control of governments, but in occupied countries such as Denmark and France, filmmakers engaged in surreptitious filmmaking and screening of non-fiction materials as an act of potent defiance. So you got this film now, watching it is an act of defiance, a certain type of film during the war. In many respects, the British documentary movement entered its heroic period with the onset of the war. After Grierson's departure in a series of magnificent documentaries about wartime England, Humphrey Jennings revealed what was ordinary and quintessentially British in London's determined resistance to German occupation and the German Blitz. In the Soviet Union, with roughly 400 cameramen sending footage back from the front, produced numerous combat newsreels under the supervision of Roman Grigoriev. In Japan, after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the U.S. government mobilized rapidly for war and began to produce numerous documentaries through the Army Signal Corps, the Office of War Information, and other organizations. The military, however, did not turn to their left-leaning documentaries who had developed their skills in the 1930s, but to directors from Hollywood who were drafted into the service and given military rank. So, after the hostilities ended, the U.S. War Department produced such war-relative documentaries as Death Mills, about the Nazi concentration camps, and Nuremberg, about the Nuremberg trials. So the war has ended now, a different type of documentary emerges post-World War. After the war, documentary entered a crisis which lasted almost 15 years. The decline transcended region and politics, but the general causes were often buttressed by circumstances specific to individual national cinemas. Documentary had become too closely associated with this wartime role as propaganda. Its polemical stance was now considered anathema. Documentary, moreover, had traditionally been an alternative practice. In the post-war period, television offered employment for those unwilling or unable to work in the featured film industry. War continued to be a subject for Chinese documentary thanks to Civil War and then the Korean War. In British documentary faced a crisis in the immediate post-war era. The Labour government, elected in 1945, seemed to many to be the realization of what they had fought for in the 1930s, and as a result, their films lost their polemical edge. In Great Britain and elsewhere, the documentary practice was most vital at the fringes. So, in France, post war, the French government routinely subsidized shorts, particularly documentaries, as a way of rebuilding a national cinema. A law prohibiting the screening of double bills then helped ensure that the films a theatrical release. So they even enacted laws about double bills, the double features that had to play certain films in France. In France, they started subsidizing they film with government funds, which creates a different type of artist. That you don't have to scramble and hustle for the money to make the film in the sense that we do now. Canada was one country where governmental support nurtured a rapidly expanding governmentary movement. It was set up by John Grierson in 1939. The National Film Board of Canada had a staff of 800 by the end of the Second World War, but faced retrenchment, budget cuts, and political crisis. All right, I'm going to end this video now, and you guys can read the chapter, and don't forget to take the quiz. All right, see you on the flip side.